All right, well, welcome everyone to the RCR Wireless News Open Source Webinar. I am Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief here at RCR Wireless News. And today, along with our esteemed panel, we will be discussing the open source software in terms of the growing use of those platforms by telecom operators. Joining me today to provide the insight into these topics are a wide range of experts, including Danny Cooperson from Analysys Mason, who will provide an analyst overview on some of these topics. John Isch from Orange Business Services provide a carrier perspective on open source software. And Suzanne Kelleher from Earthradisys and Brian Hill from Sonus to provide a vendor perspective on the topic. The plan is to leave the final 15 to 20 minutes of the webinar for a Q&A from those of you listening in on the webinar. Please feel free during this event to send those questions along using the questions tab in the control panel. If you have a question for a specific member of the panel, please make sure to include their name in the question as well. Otherwise, I will try to direct those questions to the most appropriate panel member. For those that might be having audio difficulties, we will try to speak as loudly as possible, but please make sure to check your audio settings as well. All right, well, here's a slide giving some background on RCR Wireless News. We've been covering the mobile space for more than 30 years and have a pretty lengthy history in covering the wireless ecosystem dating back to the early 1980s. And before jumping in, more details on this topic can be found in a new report we have just finished up looking at the open source software space that is, I've been told, now available on our website. So please check that out at rcrwireless.com. All right. So that said, I want to start by giving a quick overview on the open source software topic, tapping into some of the findings from that report. Since there's such a prominent panel here and I'm fighting a cold, I will quickly zoom through some slides here. But for those that want to take a longer look at the slides, we will have a replay of this webinar on our site shortly after its conclusion. That should allow for a more detailed look. All right, so quickly, we kind of tackled quickly what is open source. Obviously, this model is most often linked to a model in which source code for an application or architecture is available to others to alter or help in developing. While it's sort of a nebulous topic and one that would seem to have a pretty long history, it appears that its more formal definition was not really nailed down until the late 1990s, tied to the release of the Netscape browser. And I think we can all agree that anything that is Netscape related is pretty awesome. So it's a good foundation there. By the early 2000s, open source received a boost from the formation of the open source development labs, which focused on the Linux platform for enterprise computing. OSDL eventually merged with the Free Standards Group in 2007 to form Linux Foundation, which is seen today as one of the main supporters of open source software, especially that targeting the telecom space. All right. The telecom industry itself does have a pretty significant history in terms of using software to help run network operations, but beyond platforms derived by the likes of 3GPP, most of these were somewhat proprietary in nature. Operators could tie some network operation and equipment from multiple vendors together, but the software vendor or the software behind those operations were often seen as far from being open. The telecom space more recently has begun to take a more web-based view and computing view of the open source space, highlighted by what we have seen in terms of growing operator and vendor moves towards deployment plans using cloud, NFV, and SDN technologies. This is being helped by rapidly maturing ecosystems surrounding telecom-focused open source platforms. In terms of operators being on board with open source, it seems most are, with many being very vocal in that support. I think we have all seen the numerous announcements from the likes of AT&T, Verizon, Orange, SK Telecom, China Mobile, and Telefonica in terms of their support for open source platforms. While there are many claimed benefits to adopting open source, some carriers have specifically noted the ability to reach outside of the traditional vendor model in those moves towards open source platforms. We also looked at some of the organizations that have sprung up recently around the open source model, which operators have noted was significant in that these organizations provide a bit of a template for software development. Okay. Some of those supporting entities include Etsy, which has recently begun to base some of its telecom initiatives on open source platforms like the open source Mano initiative. There are also several initiatives that have come out of the Linux Foundation, with a number of operators touting the work of OPNFV and Open Daylight, to name just two of those. Now, obviously, with this move towards software and telecom operator networks, there's a lot of challenges that have cropped up from this move. While many open source focused vendors or entities make strong arguments that open source is the only way to go, when it comes to the telecom space, there are indeed numerous and significant challenges. While operators are eager to get out from under the legacy vendor lock model, there is a level of comfort that has been built up in terms of vendor-specific platforms being able to support the needs of the telecom space. Operators are looking to adapt the fast fail model of the web world, but there are service level metrics, standards challenges, and regulatory issues that are often preventing that adoption. Operators are also not likely to want to adopt models in which platforms are rolled out under the assumption that any bugs in the software can be updated on a regular basis going forward. There are also significant challenges for vendors that I think we are seeing are beginning to impact a number of traditional telecom vendors in the space. These vendors are now having to share a piece of the pie and a seat at the table with the new entrants, which is forcing a rethink of traditional business models. Again, this is good for operators, but a challenge for some vendors. And despite the challenges, though, vendors are beginning to adopt open source more deeply into their operations and have quickly joined many of the new open source organizations and initiatives that have been launched. And again, this is just a quick overview on the topic. And for more insight, please, like I said earlier, please check out the report we have on our website, rcrwireless.com, to get some more details there on the topic. And as a reminder, as we're going forward here on the webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the questions tab on the control panel there and send those in. We'll be saving the last 15 minutes or so to get to some of those questions. All right, my voice made it. So with that, I want to now bring on Dana Cooperson from Analysys Mason, provide a bit of a analyst perspective on the topic. So Dana, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. Great introduction. So what I wanted to talk about today is maybe a little bit of the context to start with around open source, because it's a little bit more complicated than just how does open source fit into the whole value chain. So if we can go to the next slide, Dan, we created a picture here through some of our research that looks at this complex way of working. So on the left-hand side, you see the open source communities in all their glory of acronyms, and they kind of interact with the vendor solutions that might be more proprietary. Vendors take from open source communities, they give back to open source communities, and similarly, particularly the larger communication service providers have their own labs, and they give into the community and get back from the community. So it's kind of a give and take, which together creates some solutions. Then there's this whole other part of the value chain, which could be, depending on the type of solution, could involve all the different or some of the different standards organizations. I have also acronym soup there at the top of the middle slide. And then sometimes there's an interim step or just a different kind of a step, which would relate to industry consortia, multi-source agreements, interoperability agreements, those sorts of things. So a couple of those that have come up more recently are things like OpenROADM, which is disaggregation of the optical WDM platforms, and also this transport API, which is a way for different vendors to interact in the transport network in SDN. So sometimes, when we did this slide about 6 or 8 months ago, things that were sort of more in the consortia or MSA category have moved into back to the left in the green box into the open source community. So sometimes what happens is folks start to sponsor them and organizations start to sponsor these efforts. And then finally, you've got this series of vendor ecosystems, a vendor getting together with other vendors to do sort of interoperability within the ecosystem is a long-standing tradition. Talk about that a little bit more later, but all those things kind of interact in order to get to that next pink block to the right, which is interoperability. And there's going to be feedback loops throughout this whole process at the different levels. And then finally, the CSPs decide what they're going to deploy, and then they deploy it. So that's ultimately, of course, the goal. And really the goal here is interoperability of both the hardware and the software. And why? Because you want to achieve the benefits of virtualization and even more specifically automation. In order to make the networks more affordable, for one thing, and more flexible, and to be able to handle new client needs much more quickly. So that sort of fast fail issue that that Dan just talked about. But what are some of the challenges inherent in where we are in this process today? Well, I mentioned before that when we looked at this diagram about 6 months ago, some of the things that were sort of in the middle of the diagram had moved to the right. There's a lot more things now in that alphabet soup to the left, I should say, not the right. And so there's these communities, and they're proliferating, they're mutating. In some cases, they're merging. It's really quite something for both vendors who have to put real people who they pay real salaries to put them and say, you're going to be working with this. And for the carriers, there's very few carriers that can afford to spend a lot of their personnel time creating, developing things. So AT&T is one example of a company that is doing that. I think, Dan, in your report, you mentioned something like AT&T has 100 developers just on Open Daylight. There aren't a lot of vendors, or certainly not a lot of CSPs that can afford to do that. The other thing is that something could, like eComp, AT&T's eComp could start out as one thing and then mutate into something else, which is they're calling Open eComp now, which is, I believe, just put into the Linux Foundation as an open source project. And by the way, essentially directly competing against OpenO, which is another Linux Foundation sponsored effort. So we'll see where that goes. And again, that's one of those things that makes it really difficult for the players in the market here to determine what it is they what do they want to back. The third issue that we see is that things that are, I'm calling down the stack in air quotes, so the Vim, things like that, OpenStack, they're a little bit easier to stand behind and to have progress made and to think that they're not going away. Also, across industry efforts like OCP that Suzanne's going to talk about later, the Open Compute Project, those things, they extend beyond telecom, as does OpenStack. So those kinds of things are have a little bit more legs on them. And they're easier a bit easier. I won't say they're easy to do, but they're easier to do than things that, in air quotes, up the stack. So things that relate to the Mano and specifically things that relate to management and operational aspects of making these new virtual automated networks work. So we expect a fair amount of contention with the open source projects that are that take up more or that exist higher in the stack. And I already mentioned the fourth bullet, that few service providers can really afford major contributions. They'll sort of sit on the sidelines, and maybe they'll take a look at the code, but it's hard for them to devote the resources to development. But we'll see. They can certainly be doing that. If we move on to the next slide, it's kind of looking at this ecosystem and the open source community a slightly different way. On the left, I'm just sort of showing some of these sort of recursive arrows where you work on code and it goes upstream and then becomes a distribution. We have seen a fair amount of what we call forked distribution. So they'll take the truly open source distribution and then modify it somewhat. We saw that a lot with OpenStack, and we think we're starting to see less of that. We're starting to see some vendors say, maybe not, maybe we'll just go with a distribution, or we'll go with somebody else, like a Red Hat or a Canonical or somebody like that, that's truly in this business of distributing open source code, and we'll use it from them, and then that gets ported into vendor solutions, and they may or may not return code, and it all starts over again. So that's kind of what the left-hand side of this is about. But I wanted to focus more on the right-hand side, which is just the role of ecosystems, and it specifically in software and telecom. It used to be that an ecosystem was kind of more bespoke. It was more per project. It was more this company gets together with that company and customizes something and creates some adapters for this particular installation. And then they might have some pre-integration stuff that they've done in their labs and some pre-built adapters when they think that certain things are going to be pretty interesting to a fair number of their customers, but mostly it's kind of ad hoc. What we believe we're going to is much less customization. So things that are prepackaged and model based, so that once you've got the model, you can extend the model. You don't have to kind of rewrite all the code every single time, and it's much more off the shelf. And if we can get to that in part by using open source, but just the way these ecosystems are created around the open source communities themselves and beyond, that we can get some network effects and everybody can kind of take advantage of that. It can all be much more sustainable. But I guess the bottom line here is to make this open source and the use of these ecosystems more generally more of a success in telecom. It really requires a lot of change on the part of the vendors, and particularly the network equipment vendors. They have to change the whole way they make money and how they add value, which is kind of a big deal. It's nothing small. They might have to decide, first of all, what role they want to play. Are they going to be kind of more integrators for best of suite? Are they going to be specialists for more best of breed and then be integrated into somebody else's overall solution and scenario? They're going to have to maybe change from, certainly you're going to have to change from selling boxes with embedded software to selling not only licensed software, but more software related services. Because if it is truly open source, then there's really not a license attached to it. There's a subscription for related services, and there will be professional services, but it's a fairly big change in where they get their money, and as noted, how they make value in the market. And I'm sure we're gonna hear from a couple of our panelists on that point. We're also seeing some vendors say, well, gee, I have this cool thing. Maybe I should look to create an open source community around it, and then I can provide the distribution and support services and so on. So we're starting to do some scenario planning with some of the vendors who are looking at doing that. I already mentioned the forked versions. I think they're becoming a little bit less popular. And finally, of course, the carriers themselves, the communication service providers, have to change the way they operate. And I think one of the key questions there is, how much does this really have to be telco specific? Because the more things become telco specific, the less of those network effects there are, and the more they have to figure out how they're going to contribute to the open source communities. And they have to create their own way of dealing with the DevOps way of doing things. And I think that's a fairly major cultural change. We're certainly seeing some large carriers in particular do that, but we'll see. If we can move on to the next one, please. I just wanted to end with an example of looking at eComp and that sort of idea of, as you go up in the stack, things get a lot more difficult, and the more you're trying to worry about how you're actually operating a network, it gets more tricky and complex. So we've got a diagram here of what eComp sort of looks like, and there's 8 subsystems that are split into design time and runtime parts of the platform. And then you can see too, OpenO is basically trying to do the same thing, only different, as my algebra teacher used to say. And we'll see what happens, especially now that they're both under Linux, the Linux Foundation. These may come together, we don't know. Then there's the open source Mano that the Etsy is right now standing behind, and Dan mentioned that before, but it's a very specific piece, at least today, of this bigger whole that the other 2 communities are trying to take on. So we'll see what happens with that. We've got a couple of big carriers jumping in on eComp or Open eComp, and we've got other people jumping in on OpenO. So we'll see what happens, and whether or not what happens with this hybrid coexistence, which is a whole other issue I won't get into today, but how all this stuff interacts with the existing OSSs is a huge issue for the carriers as well. So I think I just sort of close off here, de facto standards, that's the good stuff. I really think of, for the benefit of the vendors, I really see this as a as an extension of platform strategies that vendors have had for quite some time. So instead of every box being handcrafted, we went to this platform where you got the same software load and all that kind of stuff across multiple platforms. Now this is sort of like, okay, you take piece parts that exist from around the world and these various communities, and then you incorporate it into your product, and you provide the value add on top of that. So you focus on what you do well, and then you can use open source to cost reduce and improve your time to market. And I'll leave it there. The next 3 slides, Dan, are just sort of background material for folks when they download the slides and what it is Analysys Mason does.
Perfect.
That sounds
great. Thanks so much, Dana. Definitely appreciate that. And if anything, the beauty of open source, I think, is it just brings more acronyms to the telecom world. It's definitely a market that has not had enough acronyms. I think we can all agree. And so now having a few more, I think, is good for everybody. So I think, if anything, it's good for that. But Dana, again, definitely appreciate the insight there. Obviously, a lot happening in the open source space, and definitely appreciate your insight there. And before we bring on John, I want to also remind those listening in that if you do have any questions for our panel members, to please, again, use that questions tab there on the control panel and send those in, and we'll be saving the last 15 minutes or so to get some of those questions. So again, thanks for the help there, Dana. And now with that, I want to bring on John Isch from Orange Business Services to talk a bit about, I guess, a carrier perspective on this whole open source craziness that is going on. So hey, John, thanks for joining us. We definitely appreciate it, and the floor is all yours.
All right, thanks. And it was really interesting listening to Dana go through that, because, you know, she verbalize things in a completely different manner than, you know, I would, coming from a carrier perspective. But it's interesting to hear that it's a very consistent message, I think, that you're going to hear through this session today, that around open source, and, you know, how and why and what the problems are that we see as we go through that. Just before we jump into Orange, and I'll talk mainly about where we're going with SDN, NFV, and that kind of thing. But from a corporate perspective, you see on the left-hand side of this slide is the Orange Group, which is the overall Orange operating company. And on the right-hand side is more about the Orange Business Services, is what I represent here. So just at a high level, you know, we're a large global carrier. Speaking from the Orange Business Services perspective, you know, we have over 3,000 multinational customers, and a network that operates in some 220 countries and territories around the world. When I'm involved with things like this, sessions like this, that's a key differentiation between maybe an Orange Business Service perspective versus others. And Dana talked a little bit about you know, disruptions using open source and that kind of thing, and established service providers that we use, or established vendors that we use. And it's really important for us that anything we deploy in our network has to be available globally. We have to have support globally. And, you know, that's a maybe slightly different perspective than some other carriers, but it's something really important. And even though you might not think of it in terms of open source, it's very, very important that we bring what we bring to our customers, the services that we bring to our customers, are globally available and supportable. And that isn't always the case. You know, there are the shiny new object of today may not be the right thing for us to plug into our network, depending on whether or not we can support it for our customers globally. So if you go to the next slide, this slide depicts the SDN NFV architecture that we're deploying within our environment. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but you can see the various systems that we've deployed. I think this is a fairly standard way that a carrier would deploy. But we have the BSS and OSS on top. We have the operating support system with the orchestration, VNF managers, and configurator in the middle. The VNFs themselves you see represented as orange blocks in the middle. I'll talk about those in just a few minutes. And then we've got the VIM and the network controller that allow us to create the programmable network for customers. Where those the VNFs actually live, either in servers, x86 servers that exist in our POP, or at we're calling it distributed NFV or UCPE, a white box. There's a lot of different labels for what you might call that, but there's the other deployment model, which is saying, okay, I've got equipment at the edge that will house my VNFs and allow me to run, spin up a VM and launch a VNF into a remote piece of equipment. If you go to the next slide, this shows so the first, the slide before shows the architecture of what we're doing it, and this is the way that we will deploy our SDN, SDN NFV architecture. And you see that you have on the right-hand side a customer self-service portal. So this would be the customer's interaction with our system. You have the SDN orchestra, which is orchestrating the control of the deployment and operation of the VNFs within our environment. And then you see on the top in the left, I guess we'll start on the top, you see the NFV POPs. So basically those are where we have x86 servers deployed, and that is where we spin up VMs and run those VNFs in the POP. And then on the left-hand side, you see the next gen CPE, which is, white box UCPE. Again, a lot of different terms for that. But this would be, a device that we put at the prem. And again, we use that same SDN orchestration platform to drive those, to launch the VMs and to distribute the VNFs out to either the edge or to the core of the network. So a couple key points about this this strategy and what we're doing here is that it gives us the ability to be very flexible with where we put a VNF. So the classic one I always use is a firewall. So if I have a customer site that has no internet access, so they're running completely off an MPLS, or maybe they have internet but they're running it over an IPsec tunnel back to the network, then I can deploy a firewall VNF at a POP and use that as my centralized gateway to the internet. So that can be my one way to get to the internet. And for a lot of our customers, that is the preferred method, right? They don't want to have a gateway at every site. They don't want to have a firewall at every site because of the security concerns of having that many quote unquote holes in the network. So then, but in other cases, we have customers who say, hey, look, I want to do that. I want to split tunnel. I want to send my internet traffic out locally from the edge. And in those cases, we could deploy the same VNF. Instead of deploying it into a POP, we deploy it at the edge. And so this gives us a great deal of flexibility in how we're deploying it and where we're deploying it and those kinds of things. So this is, kind of shows you how we, how as a carrier would leverage SDN NFV and open source to create an environment that's entirely different than how we deploy services today, right? The old way of deploying services, every box has, not every service has its own box for one, but every service also has its own management platform. So instead of having one orchestration platform where I can do service chaining and those kinds of things, I've got multiple, I don't know if we would call management platforms in the past, but if we want to maybe stretch that and call it an orchestration platform, I have multiple orchestration platforms running multiple functions on my customers. And when I want to make a change to my customer's environment, then I have to make changes to all those individual portals and all those individual orchestration platforms. So this really gives us a great deal of flexibility, gives us a great deal of to add value to a customer's environment, to create that service chain kind of an environment for a customer. So the key point here, best of breed, multi-vendor virtualized services. Dana talked a little bit about this before, but how do this allows us to stay away from that vendor lock-in where we have one orchestration platform and then every function that works within that orchestration platform is from the same vendor. We don't work in an environment where, there is one vendor who can supply everything our customers are looking for. I don't see that ending. I see us going for a long time, having multiple vendors doing multiple features within our network, and this allows us to do that. If you go to the next slide. So this will be my last slide. So talk a little bit about what are the benefits of open source. I've talked about some of these as we've gone through here, but best of breed functions for our customers. So some customers are very prescriptive on what services they want and what vendors they want. So the ability to use open source allows us to meet that demand and to find the best service for a given customer. And by the way, that also allows for competition within a feature set. So if I want a given virtual network function and I have two competing vendors who have the same service, that creates a good environment for both the big carrier as well as the customer to have some competition both in feature and in price to make that the best way. I talked about the flexibility, the simplification of control. So I have virtualized functions for multiple vendors, but I can create an environment that makes them look very similar from an orchestration platform perspective. The flexibility in design, so I can deploy a VNF where I want it, not where I have a box. You know, if I have, wherever I have a VM, I can put a VNF. That's really important and really makes it very flexible for us. This really, I think Dana touched on this as well, is this, as much as we want to be, you know, plug and play with all this stuff, that is not the case. And we need to do integration testing to make sure that everything works. And I've seen a couple customers that I've talked to have tried to go down the road of saying, okay, I'm going to do an SDN type deployment on my own. But you know, Dana said not every carrier can afford to have 100 engineers working on software. There's even fewer customers who can do that, and especially specifically for a carrier, for you know, their network. So leaving that to the carrier makes a lot of sense. The last thing that I'll talk about is has to do with billing, and this is actually one of the major things that we've got to work through on this. Dana touched on it, but in an environment where a vendor is used to selling a box with 3 years of maintenance on it, and you know, the software licensing that goes with that. And in the future, we're looking at a model where you know, they're selling a monthly subscription to software. That's an entirely different business model, and something that we look to make consistent through this through having a service available like SDN through our SDN-MV architecture. But it's an area that there's a lot of growth that needs to happen, a lot of changes to the way service providers put functions into a network, and the way that we in turn sell those functions to our customers. So that kind of gives hopefully a kind of an overview of how open source looks and how we leverage it, and the benefits that we can bring to our customers as we go down this road.
Perfect. That sounds great. Well, John, definitely appreciate the insight there. And I want to also, before we jump off the topic here really quick, is, yeah, as John mentioned at the beginning of his part there, you know, the global nature of Orange, for instance, and one of the challenges it does seem like is in terms of the regulatory environment. I know a lot of operators, you know, might only work in one country, which simplifies regulatory challenges, especially when it comes to open source deployments. Again, for a company like Orange, having to deal with regulatory issues around the world, that just adds even more, not stress necessarily, but makes it a more difficult proposition when you have to deal with you know, various platforms and things like that. So obviously it's a big task.
It can also do the reverse, though, in cases where we have to get a box into country, and you know, there are customs and all that kind of thing with every function that we bring in. If we're deploying a white box that has the ability to run multiple functions, now I'm no longer, you know, trying to drag a box through customs. I'm simply delivering software to a box that already exists out there. So there's a positive end to that as well, you know?
Oh, makes sense. That makes sense. That sounds great. Well, hey, John, definitely appreciate the insight there. And again, John will be part of the Q&A session here at the end of the webinar. And for those who might have any questions for any of our panel members so far, for myself, for Dana, or for John, please feel free to use the questions tab there on the control panel and send those in. And like I said, we'll try to get to those at the end of the webinar here. But with that, I do now want to bring on, let me make sure my clicker here is working. I'm in charge of the slides here, so I'm the one to blame for all this. But now with that, I want to bring on Suzanne Kellier from Earthradisys, talk a bit about the company, its view on the open source space. So Suzanne, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it, and the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here. It's fun to talk about open source and hear it being discussed from all different perspectives. So we had Dana with the analyst perspective, and a lot of what we are doing at Earthradisys, I think, fits with what she had spoke about. And John, from the, you know, a carrier's perspective, also very useful. What Earthradisys and my product line, the DC Engine platform, is targeting is the NFV space, the virtualization, hyperscale virtualization space with infrastructure. And Earthradisys credentials for that, you know, we've looked at this transition to open source as an opportunity for us. We have 25 years in the telecom, datacom equipment space, hardware focused. We've also got 25 years to our acquisition of experience through our acquisition of Trillium software in the protocol, telecom and datacom space. And we see coupling that together to provide a new, you know, solution to customers focused on this agile DevOps world, where you're taking open source hardware. You're taking open source or open compute hardware together with open source software, as well as maybe commercial third-party COTS software, and integrating that together. So our solution is focused on taking that expertise in hardware that we have together with the expertise in software and software development, integration, and professional services that we have, and providing that to communication service providers, large enterprises who are making the transition and want some support. You can move to the next one. Yeah. So what we have as part of the DC Engine product line is it's a rack-based solution. It has at the top of rack integrated switching, and we have at the bottom of the rack integrated power, and then in the middle, the vast amount of the real estate is available 38U of space to compute and storage, and we offer solutions for compute, high density compute, storage, and solutions tailored to different applications. So you take that, and that is the design on which the DC Engine is based is been contributed by Earthradisys to the Open Compute project, the OCP project, as part of CG Open Rack 19. So that's an open rack solution and that concept. And DC Engine is a commercially available product based on that specification. We have multiple vendors who are working to create different modules for the ecosystem. So you have that environment, the rack, the hardware-based solution, and we offer the integration of software, be that open source or commercial, and taken together with our professional services people, as well as our management and automation tools for the hardware management, gives you our Earthradisys DC Engine platform.
All right.
What's unique about Earthradisys is our ability to, provide that hardware, to meet the particular application requirements together with your software, fully integrated and done quickly in the sense of providing you an integration, on your site within a week. So, obviously that takes some upfront planning and work on our site to make that happen. But what you can see is some of the lower level work of creating that Vim infrastructure can be done through a partner. And choosing a good partner is important in making the transition, helping you select the software, integrating it, delivering it ready so that you can just bring it into your infrastructure and be ready to go.
Okay.
And case in point, we had a partner of ours that we worked with, Verizon, presented at MesosCon in 2016 about some work that we did with them, where we deployed software and hardware into their COs in record time. So this was a fun project to do in the sense that it was a true sort of DevOps where they had a need to be up and operational quickly, and we were able to meet that in record time with a an integrated solution, and that's the DC Engine product located on the depicted on the right-hand side of the slide.
Perfect. Gotcha. Oh, there we go. There. Perfect. And that there. Great. Well, again, Suzanne, I definitely appreciate the insight there. And for those who are actually listening in, if you do have any other questions, like I mentioned earlier, please feel free to use the questions tab there, and we'll try to get those questions at the end of the webinar. And with that, I want to now bring on Brian Hill from Sonus to talk a bit about Sonus's perspective on the topic as well. So Brian, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Dan, and hello, everyone. So I want to talk a little bit about Sonus here at the beginning. I hope many of you are familiar with us from previous webinars, but if not, we're a 20-year-old publicly traded company. We provide communication solutions, telecom solutions through the years to enterprises, large enterprises, and tier one, CSPs, tier one worldwide type of carriers. We reached back 20 years ago to replacing the long haul TDM networks with voice over IP, transitioning through voice over IP, NFV into the cloud. So kind of where we find ourselves now is looking at the cloud solution for real-time communications. Our focus going forward, and for a while now, has been the security, the intelligence, reliability, scale of real-time communications in the cloud. So when I think about security, certainly, IPsec, TLS, rogue media detection and prevention are all kind of the classical security device, security capabilities you would need for real-time communications, and certainly in the cloud. But in modern times, it's much more than that. Bad actors, right? Security of theft of service, and that way get detected, and they can become blacklisted. But in addition to being blacklisted, they should be shared amongst other devices in the network for that certain customer. So when we talk about security, it's much more than just the traditional security that you would have with real-time communication, but more of a information sharing amongst all devices in a cloud. Intelligence, here we're talking about, well, what I just mentioned, security, orchestration, and telling other devices, hey, we blacklisted a certain endpoint, it's a bad actor, so they can do the same. Also, in addition to that, we have the ability to accept information like that from other security devices or security orchestrators. So that's kind of the intelligence, but of course, in addition to that, it's software-defined networking. With what we know about real-time communications and sessions and media and handling media and so forth, it allows us to use open daylight APIs to reach out into the network and leverage software-defined networking. Reliability, through our heritage, we're highly available. We're kind of that carrier class thing. Some enterprises are not as concerned about it. Certainly our higher end carrier class and cloud type CSPs are, for sure. And scale. I want to kind of transition now to open source, but scale of tens or hundreds of sessions or calls per second in that range, tens of calls per second, is one thing, and you can get solutions in open source. But open source also allows you to scale to thousands of calls per second and hundreds of thousands of sessions in a real-time communication device in the cloud. So if we can go to the next slide.
Sure, again, thank you. Yep.
So OpenStack has become an important part of our strategy going forward. But open source, we reach back to Linux, open source Linux. We used to OpenSSL, packages like that kind of replaced some vendor products years ago. DPDK, the formerly Intel but now open source data plane toolkit. I know I got the D wrong. In any case, OpenStack. And OpenStack. So that's a fundamental piece of what we've integrated now. In terms of content and timing and ongoing support, so we've engaged with NFVI vendors. We're not an NFVI vendor. We endeavor to be, a real-time communication cloud, best-of-breed application. And through that, we found that NFVI vendors take the OpenStack distributions. They frame it into a solution that they then sell to customers. And those are the typical OpenStack vendors we have been working with and been working with our customers. Some of the where it gets a little tricky is when certain vendors take certain distributions and deploy them. The vendors, how they will sustain that going forward, and when they will move to the next OpenStack distribution. So we found maybe over the last year and a half, some very interesting and exciting features come into the OpenStack community that we've worked with and leveraged along the way. So, from a virtual CPE, was mentioned earlier by, I think, John, but from a low-end virtual CPE, it's one thing with OpenStack. When you get to the high-end CSP, that's where other capabilities become very, very important. So I think about the allowed address pair we got in Icehouse. That enabled HA failover capabilities with very low media loss to be deployed within a cloud. SRIOV, the single root IO virtualization, CPU pinning, NUMA, many things that were contributed into the OpenStack community, we've integrated and leveraged for our higher end communication service provider tier 1 type solutions. In addition, we're not just consumers, right? We're consuming this great stuff that folks are doing in the OpenStack community, but as we encounter problems, bug fixes, and so forth, you know, we reach back to the authors and we want to get that stuff back into the community so that as future solutions come out, future distributions come out, then you know those bugs are fixed. So I see OpenStack really changing our business model as was discussed, but I also see that community feel of you're getting code that works. We integrated SRIOV because somebody contributed it into the community. We integrated it, we got it working. Then we found an IPv6 issue with GPDK and SRIOV. Worked through that, got to the authors, communicated that back to the community. So I guess I like to think we're all in with OpenStack and we're contributing to the community and looking forward as new technologies roll out.
All right, very good. And there's the last one there.
Yeah, so let me talk a little bit about how we package that into our architecture on our solution at Sonus. So in the signaling piece up at the top, you can think about that as the tens to thousands of calls per second with call admission control and all the capabilities for real-time communication in the cloud. This can be a couple of CPUs, this can be 24 CPUs, depending on the call rate that you want. I don't want to get into man-hour and orchestration, but there's clearly some opportunities that we're working on to make that elastic. When I go to the right, the packet processing side, what I really want to call out is a lot of the CPU capabilities, the pure OpenStack, SRIOV, NUMA affinity, CPU pinning has enabled multi-gigabit media flows over which media will flow, and our software products will police that, will do denial of service, and forward on the media to other parts of the architecture or the customer's network. The Sonus platforms, its legacy are customers who have already deployed Sonus gear who choose and wish to leverage that. So that is built into the architecture where it can be a packet processing engine in our solution. The SDN control, with what we know about signaling and packets, we endeavor to reach out and use the Open Daylight interface to leverage that. On the transcoding piece, that's where the CPU-based, pure OpenStack CPU transcoding can occur. Leveraging the Sonus products is there, meaning our DSP farm essentially can be part of your OpenStack solution. The GPU, we got an NVIDIA in there, so we found a lot of success in doing audio transcoding and media processing in general on GPUs and are finding them in public clouds and as a potential engine for part of our solution.
Perfect.
Final piece is MRFs, off-the-shelf, third-party that any customer may have in their network. So I'll tie it off with that, and you know, appreciate the time. And Mano is something we're very interested in, and I guess that'll be a topic for another day.
We definitely have a Mano report scheduled for later this year. So yeah, we'll definitely make sure we touch on Mano. That's obviously one of those tricky subjects that, yeah, we'll see how it plays out. But again, Brian, we definitely appreciate the insight there. Thanks so much. And with that, I think we still have a few minutes, about 10 minutes left over for the webinar that we will get to some of the questions that have come in. Again, I want to thank everyone for sending those questions in. And if you have any more, please feel free to send those along here. We'll try to get to those if we can. And if not, we'll be sharing them with our panel members for potential follow-up afterwards. But first of all, there was an initial question we got in that kind of was talking a bit about, you know, whether VM, you know, was being generically used for some other terms. And that kind of, I guess, brings in the whole question of whether there's, I guess, an issue at all in terms of making sure that we're all talking about the same thing. And that kind of got me thinking that maybe, you know, maybe from Dana, I guess, maybe your view in general, Dana, I mean, is there a problem, do you think, in the industry itself in terms of making sure we're talking about the right terms when we say a lot of these things? You know, obviously, people have different views on what things are and acronyms and things like that. But I guess, is that a bit of a challenge, making sure that we're all kind of on the same page in terms of these different acronyms and terms that we're using by the industry?
Oh, absolutely. And part of it, I think, comes from a bunch of different segments of the market that used to be separate and aren't anymore. So I've seen that some of the terminology that those of us who came from the network background are used to using versus the people who came from, say, an OSS, BSS background are used to using. There's sort of a bit of a collision course there in terms like, service orchestration, or even what orchestration is. People sometimes think of that differently. And I think another one of the things that I've seen a lot, Dan, is just wanting to stay away from certain terms. So like it used to be that you knew what an OSS was, but we're finding people reluctant to use OSS anymore because they think, oh, that's an old term.
Yeah.
So I think that we're in this sort of transition of terminology period as well, where we haven't quite figured out, okay, if you're not calling some of this new stuff like a Mano, an OSS, what are you calling it? So I think we're in a big transition period as well.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, very good. Well, another question that came in, and this one I think I'll direct towards John. Someone's asking, how do CSPs differentiate their services in this new world of open source? And so, John, I don't know if you had any insight there on how you guys kind of approach that topic there.
Yeah, and I think, realistically, for whatever period of time, I guess you want to go back, there has forever been a limited number of functions and providers of, I guess what we're calling today network functions. You can think of whatever you want to, anything you want, firewall, for example. There's always been a limited set of those, and finding a way to add value to the service is the challenge that a provider has to put up. I think it has a lot to do with how do you support your customers? How do you make sure that you're not locking them into technology that might not be around tomorrow? We've all seen that in the telco environment before. And, most importantly is the service management aspect of it. How do we support the customer when there's something that goes wrong? How quickly can we get it repaired? How quickly can we get the vendor involved if we need to get them involved, get to a layer 3 escalation? So I think all those kinds of things are how we add value. I think again, I've had a couple customers go out and try and say, okay, this open source stuff makes it easy. Therefore, I'm going to create my own, SDN architecture to make this work. And, I guess two that I can think of off the top of my head went off to do that and came back and said, this is not, I thought it was bad to try and run a network. Now to try and figure out how to make the functions work together, that's not what I'm interested in. That's not my main point of business,
Yeah. So it almost seems like operators are having to kind of follow that professional services model that vendors are obviously having to do as well in terms of supporting their customers, just a different customer base, really.
Yes. No. Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Very good. All right. Well, we had another question that came in. This one maybe for the various people on the panel here, but kind of, I guess, looking at the business model for vendors in terms of how they operate in this new open source world. And that was, as I was doing the story, that was one of those tricky situations where it does seem like, most vendors, I guess, depends on where they are in the ecosystem and kind of how they've come up through the ranks, kind of approach this model differently. But maybe maybe we'll start off with, I don't know, maybe with Suzanne from Analysys, maybe get your view on maybe how you guys approach the business aspect, the business model aspect of going deeper into open source as part of your overall platform out to the operators.
Sure, Dan. Yeah, I mean, certainly, in the hardware space, it's a competitive in terms of margins, but we look at this as a multi-prong project in the sense that we're not just competing for the individual hardware of a client. We're working with them to select the software, to integrate that software, and to be part of their DevOps team, essentially their extended DevOps team. So I think, to Jeffrey, you need to look at the sort of that blended view of margin as opposed to an individual number for an individual part of the solution. There's been big attempts for many, many years that are doing that, where the hardware may be a lesser part of their overall number in terms of providing their margin numbers. And you see some of those really big TEMs that aren't making the transition, struggling in very big ways, very public ways recently. Analysys is making the transition and has been successful in finding customers to transition with.
Makes sense. All right. And maybe from Brian, I don't know if you have any insight from how kind of Sonus is also approaching that challenge there.
Yeah, I think transformation is an important point. We have a lot of customers we sell gear to, and we've been working with those customers for years. We worked them through transitions, to voice over IP years ago in many cases, and have a lot of mind share with them and talking about their desires to go to OpenStack, how they're going to get there, products they're going to need. So a lot of what we see and we develop are that future-looking product, how it integrates into a cloud solution, not just a standalone bespoke product, but if you have a security orchestrator, we have this really cool app that's going to plug right into it, and that's a really important future of deploying real-time communications in the cloud. And that's where that's a lot of R&D. There's a lot of that going on, developing code, using open source, working with customers, and that's going to be future revenue and margins. And so there's a big investment going on in the cloud right now that's going to pay off down the road.
Got it. Yeah, definitely a transformational time right now, for sure. And maybe from John, I don't know if you have maybe some impact in kind of what you're seeing from the carrier's viewpoint on how vendors are kind of approaching that challenge as well.
Well, it's a mixed bag, and I think it's hard to give a definitive answer right now. I think there are some who have really embraced, and I think the main thing to think about with this is how do you, when we turn on a function, and that's when we want to get and build from the vendor from it, and when we turn it off, that's when we want it to stop, and just ignore the rest of it, and just even that part of it where I'm essentially renting a piece of software for a definitive period of time is an entirely different model. There's some vendors who are fully embracing this, and others who I can, in talking to them, I can tell that they're working very hard to try and figure out how to make this work in the new environment. And there's some who are, I guess I would call it digging their heels in, right, and saying, no, that's not the way it's going to go. And well, I think we should have this call again in a year from now, and and we can talk about what the fallout has been, and maybe the ones digging their heels in will be the ones who come out ahead. I don't think so, but maybe.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. You're right. Obviously, it's evolving as we speak, and that's kind of the challenge of this. Is you're right. It is kind of an ever-changing thing, and yeah, I guess we'll kind of see how that all plays out there. But I guess before moving on that topic, then maybe Dana, I don't know if you have any insight. Also, maybe you can bring as well on that. That would be good as well.
Yeah, sure. And I the point I wanted to make too, and it doesn't necessarily go directly at the question of margins, but it certainly does at the shift in business model from being a product-based company to being more of a services-related vendor and a tools company. And we're seeing a lot of vendors trying to make that move into being something very different than what they used to be. And just it pays to remember, I think, and of all the CSPs out there, is that when you look at folks' results and where their money goes, way more of it goes to OpEx than to CapEx. So I'm probably going to embarrass myself, but something like 4-to-1 OpEx versus CapEx. I just don't have the figure in front of me. And so a lot of what this open source and virtualization in general is to do is to hit that OpEx problem and to make things the operational aspects of the network much more automated than they could be in the past. And that's really what's driving this. And that it certainly means that the products coming to market are going to be different, but it also means that there's going to be need for tools. It means there's going to be need for integration, all kinds of other things. And it's just a question of who can make that transition, because ultimately you want to lower the OpEx and you want to improve the agility. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, and John, just to jump in quick on that, I just want to highlight that word automation. That is a huge thing within this whole. I think sometimes, you get caught up in the technology, and you heard me, I get caught up in the billing and the pricing and the models like that. But the automation this brings to our environment cannot be underestimated, and the change that brings to our organizations is immense.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, great. Well, guys, I think we're just about out of time on this hour webinar, but I definitely want to definitely thank all of our listeners for sending those questions. The great topics there, and obviously some great insight from our panel members on those questions. So definitely appreciate that. And also, we'll be sharing the list of any unanswered questions with our panel members who, if time allows, can follow up individually on those. But and also, again, this webinar will be archived on the rcrwireless.com site in a few days for those that might have missed some of it. And please, again, check out, hold on here, let me change the slide, there we go. And please check out our feature report again on the topic that is now available on our website. Again, there's some more in-depth information there from a lot of it comes from our panel members here as well, so you get some more information there. But again, I want to thank, again, to everyone for participating today, and a special thanks to Dana Cooperson from Analysys Mason, John Isch from Orange Business Services, Suzanne Keller from RTC, and Brian Hill from Sonus for providing their insight. Thanks again, guys, for all the time and insight. And thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us, and have a good afternoon.